Alrighty, well, good afternoon and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrew Doffney and I'm the Instruction and Outreach Librarian at the New Jersey State Library. And it is my pleasure to present our speaker today in honor of Women's History Month, Dr. Betty Livingston Adams. She is an independent scholar, author, and former university professor. She holds a doctorate of philosophy with distinction and a master's of philosophy degree from Yale University and the Master of Divinity degree from Drew University, Madison, New Jersey. Dr. Adams is the recipient of numerous academic honors and fellowships, including Global Scholar at the Institute for Research on Women at Rutgers University and Fellow at the Yale Initiative on Material and Visual Culture of Religion. Her scholarship and teaching explored 19th and 20th century American and African American religious and social history through the lens of gender, race, and class. Her book, Black Women's Christian Activism, Seeking Social Justice in a Northern Suburb, which is the topic of this talk, received the 2017 Wilbur Award for Excellence in Communicating Religious Issues, Values, and Themes with Professionalism, Fairness, and Honesty. It also received the 2018 New Jersey Studies Academic Alliance Author Award for Scholarly Excellence and the 2020 Drew University Bella Kornitzer Prize for Outstanding Nonfiction Book. So welcome, Dr. Adams. We appreciate you speaking us to today. And this is a great way to segue where we came from in February with Black History Month to now what we're celebrating in Women's History Month. So we're really excited.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for that warm introduction, Andrew.
Sure. Before we jump into her talk, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. First and foremost, we will be taking your questions at the end of Dr. Adams' presentation today, but please feel free to submit them at any time using the Q&A or the chat features in the Zoom dashboard. There is a survey available at the end of the webinar, so if you have time, we ask that you please complete the survey. Again, we always appreciate any feedback that you can give us. And if you want more information about this topic and what she's going to be discussing today, you can find her book, Black Women's Christian Activism, Seeking Social Justice in a Northern Suburb. You can look at that and read it. It's a fantastic read. We have copies here at the library. You can check your local public library as well for copies of that. And it's a great way to celebrate this Women's History Month for March. One last thing, I just want to do a brief overview of the Zoom dashboard for those who might not be familiar. This is what your dashboard should look like if you're using a PC or a Mac. If you're using a mobile device, the dashboard may look a little bit different, but all the features will still be there. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can see your audio settings. So if you're using an external listening device like a headset or earbuds, you can make sure that it's connected properly there. At any point during the presentation, if you run any issues, there is a raise hand button here in the middle. You can click on that and that'll alert me. I will send you a message in Zoom and hopefully be able to solve any problems that you are having. And as I mentioned before, if you do have any questions, there's the Q&A and the chat buttons. You can use either of them to get in touch with us and we'll be happy to address your questions. So that is everything that I have for you. So it's my pleasure now to turn it over to Dr. Adams.
Well, thank you. I am so honored and delighted to share in the Author Talk series, and especially during Women's History Month. My presentation today is titled When and Where I Enter, the Vital Agency and Activism of Black Women Shaping Communities. Next slide, please. In her 1892 essay, A Voice from the South, author and educator Anna Julia Cooper wrote, quote, "The colored woman of today occupies a unique position in this country. In a period of itself in transition and unsettled, her status seems one of the least ascertainable and definitive of all. She is confronted with both a woman question and a race problem, and is yet an unknown or an unacknowledged factor in both." Cooper went on to say, quote, "Only the Black woman can say when and where I enter in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence and without suing or special patronage. Then and there, the whole Negro race enters with me. The world," she added, "needs to hear her voice." Cooper's words ring as clearly now as they did in 1892. The world needed to hear Black women's voices 132 years ago, and need to hear and see Black women now. In our time together this afternoon, I'd like to introduce you to two exemplary women who lived and worked in the New Jersey suburbs. One a domestic servant and Baptist lay leader, the other a seamstress and ordained pastor in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Both received recognition as local, state, and national leaders. Their narratives illustrate the complexities as well as the possibilities, the power and enduring legacy of Black women's organized activism, even amid racialized and gendered constructions of place and space. Next slide. In 1897, Violet Johnson, a 28-year-old single woman and North Carolina native, relocated with her white employers from Brooklyn, New York to Summit, New Jersey, and within a year organized a Baptist church that formed the nucleus of a community. In 1925, Reverend Florence Spearing Randolph, a South Carolina native and Jersey City resident, accepted an interim pastoral appointment to a fledgling AME Zion congregation in Summit, and during the Great Depression, built an institutional church. Both congregations are active in the suburb today. With an optimism born of the Civil War and the changed status of African Americans, inscribed into the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, Johnson and Randolph were prepared to assume their rightful place as citizens in a multiracial nation. Challenging the presumption that American and white were synonymous, they entered the public sphere and devised political strategies that challenged hegemonic assumptions of race and space. Though ordinary working women, these women saw themselves as equal agents with their white sisters and Black and white brothers. They established churches and created civic and social institutions, and considered it their duty to speak on social and political matters. Yet Johnson and Randolph had to negotiate a moving color line and a glass ceiling in their places of work, leisure, and worship. Despite increased evidence of a national retrenchment on the question of racial equality, this first generation of freeborn women of color retained a belief in the principles and promises of the United States Constitution. Johnson and Randolph were also women of the Victorian era, and like their white and Black middle-class sisters, they accepted Victorian values and social conventions and participated in the discourse of true womanhood and separate spheres, a discourse often at odds with a gendered and color-coded society in which Black women daily confronted both the woman question and the Negro problem. Women who worked as domestic servants, housekeepers, and laundresses defied masculine and class ideas of a woman's place, and eventually led others to envision an equitable community beyond a narrow middle-class preserve. These women served as veritable beacons and lighthouses in New Jersey's emerging suburbs. What impelled women with no power or position, no intergenerational wealth, trust funds, or high-powered connections to endeavor to transform society and make their voices heard? Though discriminated against because of their gender and their race, and having to wage discursive and material battles for physical and moral space, they nevertheless held fast to what Florence Randolph termed, quote, a vision of the potential strength and influence of a union of women and faith in their willingness to assume responsibility. That vision led them to transgress boundaries and interrogate social constructions of race and gender. At times, they worked in concert with, but often in opposition to, Black and white men and middle-class white women. Sustained by their faith and educated in the practice of organization and leadership by their religious denominations, these women fought for their institutions and their communities. Sometimes this meant simply standing up for the right to erect a church building in an overwhelmingly white town, or to have their organized women's work recognized by their religious denominations. Other times it meant engaging in direct political action through the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, the white middle-class women's suffrage movement, or the male-dominated Republican Party and NAACP. During the Great Depression and New Deal, it meant fighting for employment, healthcare, and housing, as they resisted the strategies of white homeowners to use the economic crisis as a cover to, quote, cleanse the suburb of its Black and poor white residents under the guise of slum clearance. These women were subversive and radical and determined to be heard, whether it redounded to their personal benefit or not. In the time we have together, I'd like to focus briefly on 3 moments that illustrate the extraordinary range of these women's agency and activism. First, maybe the next slide at this point, Andrew, that would be great. First, their role as essential workers in New Jersey's emerging suburbs of the early 1900s. Next, their political role in the 1920s suffrage movement. And finally, their role as advocates for education, health, and housing in the 1930s and 40s. And if time permits, I'd also like to touch upon some legacies and lessons. So for now, we'll drop the slides and maybe you'll just see and hear me. Black women's integral role in the making of the suburbs. In the late 1890s and early 20th century, New Jersey was a marketeer's dream as railroad investors and land speculators transformed pasture land into middle and upper middle class residential spaces. Affluent white businessmen and mid-level managers, determined to insulate their wives and children from New York City's teeming masses of European immigrants and working poor, escaped to the suburban frontier. Thus began the process of suburbanization that has earned New Jersey the moniker as the quintessential suburban state. African Americans played an integral role in the suburbanization process, whether as maids, cooks, nannies, gardeners, or chauffeurs. Swedish and Irish immigrants could not satisfy the middle-class demand for domestic labor. By the end of World War I, Southern-born African American women were the major providers of the skilled domestic service that made the suburban dream a reality. From the latter decades of the 19th century to today, suburban space has been valorized as white, middle class Protestant space. However, such a valorization did not go uncontested, and much of that contestation arose from the mere presence of Black women who believed with Anna Julia Cooper their voices needed to be heard. Living and working on the margins of the suburban North, Black women's personal lives were never private. Highly visible, yet morally suspect, they were under the gaze of Black and white men and white middle-class women. Because of their gender, they remained in subordinate positions within their own churches, while in white women's domestic spaces and organizations, their race and their gender were problematic. Yet from the margins, ordinary Black women created institutions and actively participated in the struggle for social justice. In exploring the range of moral and spatial choices over a period of profound social and economic change, the suburbs emerge as a discursive and physical site for the negotiation of meaning and power. Locating Black women's activism in this historical context and in space generally coded as white and middle class, centers the role of ordinary women and adds a complexity to our understanding of how women, like Johnson and Randolph, women who operated in liminal space and required white middle-class concurrence to move forward, entered the public sphere and exercised agency as they navigated the complicated intersections of race, class, and gender. The suburban venue also reminds us that we experience national and international events in intimate spaces. The world in which Black women lived and worked was highly sexualized and gendered. Their presence was culturally charged. Middle-class white suburbanites raised questions about their sexuality as well as their ability. Yet, with little status or positional power, these young women entered public space, reframed issues, and built and sustained communities. Now moving into the political arena. Historically, women's suffrage was positioned as a white middle-class women's movement. Suffragists ignored working-class white and Black women, as well as immigrant women. In the South, white women, with the help of Northern allies, framed a woman's right to vote as a counter to the Black male vote. Never mind that most Black men in nearly every Southern state had been driven from the polls through illegal and violent voter suppression tactics. In New Jersey, elite white upper and middle class women considered women's suffrage a matter of gender equality with their husbands and brothers, exclusively for themselves. Conversely, Black working women had their own reasons for wanting the right to vote. They believed that with a ballot, they could elect upright candidates, help enact just laws, and thereby inject morality and justice into the civic realm for the benefit of all women, children, and families. They would add political power to their community service. Despite the disparaging trope of working women generally, and of Black working women in particular, their gender consciousness, their agency, if you will, led them to form interracial coalitions with more powerful Black and white men and middle-class white women. They resisted and subverted, cooperated, and partners as they worked for what they called God and humanity. Their willingness to cross boundaries proved pivotal in the struggle for women's suffrage in New Jersey. Despite years of campaigning, women's suffrage in the Garden State remained unpopular with the all-male electorate. In 1915, following yet another resounding defeat of the women's suffrage referendum, a defeat for which white middle-class women blamed Black and European immigrant women, Black working women organized the State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, with Reverend Florence Randolph as president. For many Black women, the State Federation was the first non-religious organization they had ever joined, and it served as a bridge from missionary work to political activism. Significantly, Black women's organizational presence changed the political calculus. With formation of the State Federation, working-class African-American women throughout the state reached a new level of autonomy and visibility. Without rejecting their gender, race, or class, they defined their own model of womanhood. For them, organization mattered. Whereas Black women may have been invisible to white suffragists in the past, by 1917, the political ground shifted. And white women now considered Black women's support a positive good for the cause. Adding nearly 3,000 Black club women and thousands of Black women they represented to the pro-suffrage column would be a political coup. Black women just might be able to influence the votes of their husbands, sons, and brothers to grant women the right to vote. Elite white women awakened to the realization that in politics, numbers matter. Consequently, the state's White Suffrage Association sent an informal verbal message to the 2-year-old State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, meeting in Plainfield to, quote, become identified with the suffrage work of the state, end quote. Following a lengthy discussion and keenly aware of the color line in the suffrage movement, the Federation women tabled the verbal invitation. Within 2 hours, the former and current statewide suffragist presidents appeared in person to, in their words, provide more information on suffrage to the Black women. Contrary to what the white women assumed, Black working women were quite familiar with suffrage and electoral politics. Strategically, Black women seized the moment, used the opportunity to use their organizational visibility and numerical strength to transform the elite white women's suffrage campaign into an interracial cross-class movement. They negotiated positions on the white women's executive board, gained support for the expansion of Black women's suffrage clubs, as well as the subvention of expenses for suffrage organizers and activities, and ensured a visible role for their officers in public suffrage events. Women who wore gray and black uniforms and scrubbed other people's floors, cleaned other people's houses, laundered other people's clothes, and tended to other people's children transformed the New Jersey Women's Suffrage Campaign into an interracial and cross-class movement. Their organizational strength made it impossible to deny that Black women had identities in their own right or that they were more than their work. In the critical years of the suffrage campaign, Black women reached across class and race lines to forge a women's coalition. Having learned the art of organizing and formulating action plans in their missionaries and societies and churches, Black working women entered the political arena and became a force in politics. And as their slogan declared, they were in politics to stay. In the political arena, they operated on the principle of one woman, one vote. And when they cast their ballots, more than just an election was at stake. They were voting for social justice and civil rights on behalf of their communities and future generations. They would put real American ideals in American life. Following successful passage in August 1920 of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, New Jersey's Black women organized ward and district clubs and registered voters. Their Get Out the Vote campaigns helped turn formerly Democratic municipalities into Republican wins. And I should just add, as a footnote, that during this period, most Black African Americans were Republicans. New Jersey's first elected Black legislator owed his victory to working class Black women's organizing efforts. 2 years later, they formed the Colored Women's Republican Conference, a statewide political caucus. Their effectiveness in the political arena led the New Jersey legislature to grant floor privileges to their legislative chairwoman, who worked closely with the newly elected Black legislator to draft the state's first civil rights legislation, banning discrimination in public accommodations and in education from primary grades through college. Unfortunately, by the time the bill was enacted into law, it had been considerably weakened and would later require the efforts of another Black assemblyman to strengthen the New Jersey Civil Rights Act. New Jersey's Black women made their voices heard on national issues as well. In 1922, Viola Johnson drafted a petition to Congress on behalf of the state federation that read in part, quote, "Our progress as individuals, as a group, and as a people generally has been seriously checked by racial, economic, and social disturbances, which have threatened the very foundation of the nation," end quote. The women cited specific incidents of congressional inaction: failure to pass the federal anti-lynching bill, lack of enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendments that secured African-American citizenship rights, and disregard for the 18th and 19th Amendments, the Prohibition and Women's Suffrage Amendments. They reserved their harshest criticism for the Ku Klux Klan, that embodiment of state-sanctioned mob rule and lynching. Organized on the East Coast from upstate New York to the southern Jersey shore, estimates of the size of the New Jersey Klan ranged as high as 65,000, including women and children. Even an Anglo-Saxon preserve like Princeton University had its own Klan Clavern. The Klan prominently advertised its ceremonies in local newspapers. The abandoned quarry and the parade grounds in Union County were favored spots for state Klan meetings. In November 1923, the Klan burned 13 crosses in Newark and surrounding suburbs. Visible from New York City, the flaming crosses lit up the night sky from Saturday night into Sunday morning. In a petition, Black women denounced the Klan as a terrorist order and, quote, "a curse upon our institutions." They appealed to the church and civic organizations of the community to, quote, arouse the conscience of the American public to the disgrace of this terrible blot upon our boasted 20th century civilization, end quote. Organized Black working women remained a powerful force in electoral politics into the 1930s. They clarified issues, vetted candidates, and led get out the vote campaigns. White women and Black and white men seeking elective or appointed positions sought their endorsement. For Black women, the ballot was a sacred instrument, and they intended to use it. Moving now to look at their role as advocates for education, health, and housing. Organizing the State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs and the Colored Women's Republican Club signaled a significant change in ordinary Black women's agency and activism. Their speech and behavior acts involved whole communities in public pronouncements and mobilization projects. They denounced the evil spawned by the nationalization of Jim Crow. So far as the Negro is concerned, Florence Randolph stated, there is no North, South, East, or West. It is simply a matter of numbers and circumstances. So long as we are denied full privileges of citizenship, so long as in our cities and state we have Jim Crow segregation and other offensive measures, we must have wide awake Negro women. Yes, these women were calling for people to be woke even back then. Discrimination and violence were personal. Assaults on Black women's honor and bodies were used to intimidate Black men, women, and entire communities. Federation women especially decried the virulence and pernicious effect of residential segregation, what they called the problem within the problem. The growing alarming problem of rundown sections, in their words, rundown sections northern whites are creating in almost every town. In fact, residential segregation grew through the golden age of suburbanization in the 1920s and accelerated during the Great Depression. After years of campaigning against high rents, low wages, unsanitary housing, and inadequate education, Summit's Black community found itself under surveillance and under siege. In contravention of New Jersey's civil rights laws, the school board and city council tacitly created an all-Black Jim Crow public school as white parents removed their children from one elementary school. Though staffed by a white principal and all-white teachers, some parents and realtors deemed the number of Black students too high. The following year, the Summit YMCA closed its doors to all Black youth in what it called an experiment, and subsequently severed ties with the all-Black Lincoln YMCA that Black residents organized following the expulsion. Further, affluent white housewives in Summit and neighboring Short Hills colluded to dismiss Black workers and spread propaganda to discourage those who employed them. Black women and men, quote, repeatedly heard, "No colored wanted," or "my husband is opposed to colored people," or "we're going to rid the town of colored people." Reverend Randolph turned her righteous indignation on this, quote, unholy attitude and criminalization of color. "What are you trying to do?" she asked. "Make criminals out of Negroes?" End quote. As new tax deal dollars ensured 90% financing for developers of all white subdivisions and subsidized long-term mortgages for single-family home buyers in those subdivisions, a growing white middle class demanded that the Summit City Council use federal dollars to remove white and Black working class residents, whom they labeled slum dwellers, from the center of the suburb and to rental housing projects to be built on the edge of town. Although nearly an equal number of white and Black working class families would be displaced, the local newspaper captured the racial dimension of the battle white class middle homeowners were determined to wage against their Black neighbors. The headline read, Carthage must be destroyed. Summit's Black women denounced these actions. They organized neighborhood associations to protest the blatantly race and class-based plans. They also formed interracial coalitions with civic-minded elite white women to arouse the white conscience in the fight for sanitary and affordable housing. Further, they organized conferences of African-American doctors, sociologists, and scholars, as well as Black and white religious leaders to address pernicious Northern manifestations of Jim Crow. Manifestations such as white refusal to share workspace with Black employees, expulsion of Black doctors from hospitals and clinics, biased textbooks in public schools, impediment to Black home ownership, and violence against those who moved into white neighborhoods. These women were determined to be heard. In addition, as a creative act of resistance, they expanded and amplified their mentorship and sponsorship of cultural, educational, and recreational experiences for Black youth. They recruited Black professionals from New York City and Newark and gathered young girls and boys from neighboring suburbs to form junior branches of organizations such as the Junior Colored Women's Republican and Federation Clubs, Young People's Garden Clubs, and the NAACP. Working women sponsored events to raise funds for college scholarships and organized student government associations so that Black students enjoyed leadership experiences denied them in their overwhelmingly white schools and suburbs. In speech and practice, Black women sustained their communities. Now I'd like to touch just a little bit on the legacies and lessons. As the winds of war blew over the ideal suburb in the 1940s, and evidence of World War II atrocities committed against European Jews and others became known, the color line rippled ever so slightly. Summit's civic and religious leaders, for example, publicly acknowledged the persistence of discrimination at home. Calling for a united Summit, the City Council introduced an ordinance requiring repairs or demolition of buildings unfit for human habitation. One councilman publicly denounced the town's Jim Crow Elementary School. These public pronouncements represented a moral victory for Black women who had protested against those transgressions for decades. Despite wartime promises of unity, anti-democratic and racist practices persisted. The Summit Interracial Committee admitted, quote, great difficulty in enforcing the law when it involved a Negro tenant against a white landlord, end quote. The housing ordinance lacked enforcement powers or specificity as to what constituted unfit for human habitation. And the school board continued its segregation practices. The YWCA Interracial Committee acknowledged the impotency of the state civil rights laws after its members, one of whom was Black, were refused service at a restaurant while attending a regional conference in Atlantic City. By World War II's end, the wave of interracial goodwill and expanded democracy had crashed on the ideological shoals of racism, and white supremacy. In March 1945, the Summit YMCA invited high school senior girls to join a swimming class at the only swimming pool in town. When 5 African-American girls appeared in good faith, in their words, ready to pay the requisite fee, they were denied access. Quote, and there in the presence of our white classmates, the girls reported, we were both humiliated and embarrassed by being told that Negroes were not permitted to use the pool, end quote. As these young women understood, to quote Audre Lorde, their silence would not protect them. Like Anna Julia Cooper, they believed the world needed to hear their voices. Vowing to, quote, take advantage of our freedom of speech concerning an example of unfair treatment of a minority group, end quote, they sent an open letter to the press, which they considered an instrument of democracy and fair play. They also sent copies to the town's mayor, school superintendent, and the local ministerial council. Their protest embarrassed the suburb after a New York tabloid picked up the story. While unable to halt the progression of racial discrimination or white supremacy ideology nationally or locally, the presence of ordinary working women, the institutions they built and sustained, and the young women and men they mentored reminded those who policed the boundaries of the suburban landscape, white residents, realtors, shopkeepers, religious and civic leaders, reminded them that the interests of African Americans could not be completely ignored or totally erased. As we stand at this intersection of history and time, the nexus of the past and the future, I will readily admit I am in awe of the energy, sophistication, commitment, and perseverance of these working women. Women who with little leisure time and fewer resources, but with great intentionality, perseverance, and organizational ability, accomplished so much. As I close, my hope is that the shards of a narrative of faith, activism, and resilience that extended far beyond a single suburb has illuminated the contingent strategies ordinary Black women used in their struggle for social justice, even in the midst of insuperable odds. The more I research and write about social justice, diversity, and equity, the more convinced I am that in this historical moment, the challenge before us is to organize and act. Certainly, one action each of us can take is to tell the story, reframe the narrative so that the voices of ordinary Black women who did and those who continue to do extraordinary things can be heard. The world needs to hear their voices. Thank you. Now, Andrew, if you could show the remainder of the slides. Sure. Just to give the audience a view of some of the things that enduring legacy. Summit did erect a plaque in honor of Fountain Baptist Church, the church that Violet Johnson helped organize and continue through all of the problems of this period. The next slide. And here is a picture of the church as it looked in the 1920s. After years of buying property in the center of the city and trying to get a church erected, it was not until the end of World War I that the city decided that maybe it was okay to have this Black church in what had then become a segregated Black section of town. Next slide, please. And I should add that church was, the city hall now stands where that church once stood. This is the church that Florence Randolph led her congregation to erect during the Great Depression. And this edifice remains today. It's on the historical register. And with great effort through the Depression, a small congregation in another segregated area of the suburb built this church. As I said, it remains today. Next slide. I was fortunate enough to find some of the letterhead and material that Violet Johnson and Florence Randolph and others used in the New Jersey Federation of Colored Women's Club, including the letter to Woodrow Wilson, calling for him to take action during World War I to stop all of the lynching in the country. And I think do I have another, or is that the last slide? And this is just a picture of what these women looked like when they were in their Sunday best and when they were doing their organizational work. Thank you so much. Thank you, Andrew, for managing the slides. And thank all of you. Yes, final slide. A picture of the Interracial Christian Women's Association, now known as Church Women United. This is a slide from their gathering in the 1920s at a Pennsylvania lodge, and Black women helped transform that elite Protestant organization into one that was more open and that focused on social justice issues. Thank you. Okay, back to you, Andrew.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Adams. If anybody does have questions, please feel free to send them our way, and we'll be happy to address them. I'll start off with a couple questions. Was the media favorable to the experiences of African Americans as well as women during this time? Because you mentioned that the young women, after being denied access to the pool, went to the media, hoping for publicity and change. And so how I was curious how what the interaction was between the media and these efforts of these Black women.
It was spotted, to say the least. Generally, what I found very fascinating in the local newspapers, which is, I'm not putting in a plug for local press, but we do need more local press. In the local suburban papers, there were columns and submissions by different groups and organizations in town. So things were presented. The editorial comments were generally taking the position of the majority of the population. So, for example, uh, when Violet Johnson and her congregation tried to erect a church and they bought Old City Hall, the editor of the paper said, "Oh, we know the city will not sell that building to this colored group because these were buildings in the center of town around the green." So that was not necessarily, so the public stance from the paper was to denounce that. The papers also, much like our press today, I suppose, would pick up on small things and expand any negative behavior to the entire community and take it even out of that community into the entire state. So the press was not necessarily favorable, but that did not deter the women, as it did not deter these high school girls from having their voices heard. Uh, but it's very surprising how much of the news was printed, even, no matter who submitted it.
Another question on that last slide where you had the women together. Did you find that it was easier for Black women to integrate within white women's societies rather than having Black men integrate with white men in different societies and clubs?
Well, with religious organizations, and that is a slide of Christian women, um, Protestant women, New York City, as well as New Jersey. Black men were able to align with white men rather easily in certain public and civic organizations and religious organizations. Not so much in the beginning for white women and Black women. There was always this, because the white women's organizations were led by elite white women. So there was always the class bias as well as the race bias. However, what I found fascinating in the case of the interracial religious women's organization, Black women were invited in very sparingly to share in programs. And Black women used those opportunities strategically to present viewpoints, to present papers, to invite others in with them, and began to change the conversation in rather dramatic ways. So that by the time this last slide with the women meeting in the Poconos for one of their conferences, white women were actually structuring and leading discussions. And I should also add, prior to that, Northern elite white women and Southern elite white women joined forces. So in joining their forces before Black women were invited in or came in to share, there was always this, kind of understanding among white women that it was their organization and they were indeed supporting white supremacy and the go slow attitude on everything, and did not have any concept or understanding that they were willing to voice at any rate of what the real world was like. So Black women were able to change the dynamic, change the conversation, and change the issues that came out. So that by the time these white women in the interracial conference are issuing pamphlets, and they also, the women had to fight the men in the religious organization as well. White women had to fight white men to have their voices heard. But by the time we get into the 30s and 40s, these interracial conferences are saying that the issue of social justice and race is as much a moral and religious question as it is a civic question, and something needs to be done. But it took the presence of Black women who really had to struggle to get into these organizations and have their voices heard to change that kind of conversation.
Were the experiences of Violet Johnson and Florence Randolph typical of what kind of middle-class African Americans would experience throughout New Jersey, or even maybe the larger throughout the United States?
Well, as I said, Violet Johnson and Randolph were really working class women. They were domestic servants. There were middle class Black women who were married to judges and lawyers and bishops, and those women were few and far between, but they were included in some of these white women's organizations, certainly during suffrage. The voices of um, Mary White and others who led some of these, who spoke at these places, were actually very prominent. But it was the working class women, the women, as I said, who wore uniforms, who were ignored, and they were in the majority. So these women had to, so generally, and getting back to your question, generally, domestics were not even seen, which is not unlike today. Um, Certainly in the suburban area where we have domestic servants coming in and cleaning houses and waiting on tables, rarely do you see their pictures or hear about their condition reported in the local press when we had many local presses. So there's a distinction between middle class Black women and working class Black women, and working class Black and white women, and poor immigrant women. So what I try to convey in my work is that these working class women in these affluent and overwhelmingly white suburbs were creating institutions, were making things happen. When I first moved to New Jersey some 40 something years ago, and I'd walk through the suburban towns, and somewhere near the train stations usually, or not too far from them, one would find a small church building. And yet walking down the main street of these suburban towns, it was rare that you saw any Black person either walking the streets or sitting in the restaurants or working in the shops. And I became curious as to why do we have these remnants, these relics? Who lived here and why? And indeed, it was working class women, domestic servants, and most of them, I should add, were live-ins. They did not necessarily own their own homes. They could not buy property in the city, in these suburban towns, but they came together, banded together, and formed their own communities. And in Summit, in speaking of housing, there was one physician, Black physician, who actually bought his home had a white agent buy the home for him. And his neighbors, his white neighbors, as they said, induced him to sell to them and move out because they did not want him on that street. So again, the class distinctions were very, very strong, as well as the racial distinctions in our suburbs, which I would add is not unlike it is today.
What is one of the more inspiring stories that you uncovered while doing research on this topic?
Oh, that's a very good question. Thanks for asking. There were so many inspiring stories. And I must admit, the one I ended up with these high school girls, was especially inspiring that young people wanted their voices heard and found a way to make that heard. And they did that because they were mentored by older women who understood, who could listen to them. And these girls were taking a stance against their teachers, their high school, and saying, we are part of this America. We are citizens in the suburb, and we will speak out. But then on the other hand, there were so many inspiring stories of women with no resources of their own, yet who were able to stand for their local communities, speak up for state issues, and take a position on national issues. And did not, said Violet Johnson penned the letter that the Federation sent to the president decrying conditions throughout the country. So their voices, their perspectives were just awe-inspiring. And I should also add, these women have not generally been treated as subjects in history. We write about the labor of working class people. We will write about immigrant women almost as a group without looking beyond that and saying, what did they do? How did they influence and affect their communities? How did they influence and change the conversation? And what did they leave behind for the next generation? So it really was trying to get at moving them from objects to subjects, that in their own right, in their own way, they had identities, they had ideals, and they had action and agency.
Um, where are you from in New Jersey, if you wish to share?
As I said, I lived in Summit, New Jersey for 42 years. I actually, just my background, I went to New Jersey on a corporate relocation that was supposed to last 24 months. I moved from the northern shore of the Chicago suburbs. But there's something about being in New Jersey that it just captures you and takes you in. It's such a fascinating state, I suppose, certainly for a historian. Uh, and to see how how the suburbs have grown over the 2 centuries and where we're going now with the suburbs. So I've traveled through many, different suburbs, looking through them. And certainly when one is house hunting, one gets to see many suburbs. Why, did I sound as though I,
No,
what was behind that question?
I don't, I don't know. Another one, thank you for your presentation. In the early 20th century, were live-in domestic workers counted in the US Census as residents in wealthy communities?
They actually were. They were counted as residents, discounted as voting citizens, and discounted as having a place in the civic center and the civic life of the community. However, they were essential in terms of keeping the suburbs viable and attractive places for people with money. Who else would take care of all the kids? Who else would do all the domestic work and clean the streets and all of that? So the suburb, their presence was needed, if not welcome. And it was stay in your place and we need you. So I would just say, look around your suburban town today and see where people reside and see what the housing situation looks like and why certain people live in certain places. There was this view that as folks called them in the 20s and 30s, the slum dwellers just loved living together in their slum area. And it was like, no, you won't let them buy houses in the other sections of town. Uh, and the ordinances and zoning ordinances today come under discussion in terms of how do we expand the the area so that we can have so that housing can accommodate all the people that a town will need. In many suburbs, as you know, teachers and other workers cannot even live in the suburbs in which they are working because of zoning laws in terms of single family homes. So those are the kinds of and the suburbs have taken over an American residential area. So it's looking at some of this and saying, oh, how did we get to where we are today? And the suburbs were really to be this exclusive area for wealthy people.
I'll wait to see if any more questions come in. So I'm just going to share some accolades that you received from the chat. One, thank you for this. My granny, Ethel McCoy Williams, was a former president of the New Jersey State Federation of Colored Women's Club Incorporated, located in Trenton. So,
yes, and that's where the headquarters are today, in Trenton.
And a couple from Deborah Brown. Betty, I'm happy and glad to witness that you are still putting together history that would not otherwise be told and shared. You are the best, and thank you so much for this needed light and truth on segregation on Black persons and families in the suburbs. Unfortunately, is still going on today, as you just mentioned.
Oh, thanks for that comment. Yes.
So. All right, well, I don't see any more questions, so I think we can go ahead and end it there. Thank you so much, Dr. Adams. We really, really appreciate you sharing your experiences.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to do this. And I would just encourage others to look around where you are and see what's there. There's so much, as I said, in New Jersey history that we don't know and that we benefit from knowing more about. So thank you. Thank you, everyone.
All right. And everyone, thank you for joining us today. And, this is a great way to kind of kick off National Women's History Month. So please, go out and do your research and find some inspirational women or take in other programs that are happening throughout the state and this celebration. So be safe, be well, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Goodbye. Thank you.